You grew up believing The Lion King was Disney's most original masterpiece, a story born from scratch, echoing through your childhood. But behind the circle of life, Disney hid something. The blueprint was not just Hamlet. It pointed back to an earlier anime, Kimba the White Lion. Marketing sold originality, while the truth sat in plain sight. So why has no one told you how deep the copies go, or why it matters? If you are fascinated by the dark origins behind childhood legends, subscribe to Childhood Shadows. Now, let's talk about why The Lion King was never as original as we were told. In the summer of 1994, Disney didn't just release a movie, they launched a promise. The Lion King arrived with the kind of fanfare that only a studio like Disney could conjure. Every press kit, every interview, every TV spot hammered one idea home. This was something new. Not a fairy tale pulled from old Europe. Not a recycled princess. Not a borrowed bedtime story. This was their first original animated feature, a tale born from the minds of their own artists. Linda Wolverton, the credited screenwriter, said she and her team originated the story from scratch. The message echoed everywhere. The Lion King wasn't just another Disney movie. It was a new myth for a new generation. You could feel it in the marketing, the swelling music, the golden light over Pride Rock, the voiceover that promised a story unlike anything you'd seen before. The song Circle of Life played on radios and TVS across the world, and suddenly everyone knew the words. In classrooms and playgrounds, kids argued over who got to be Simba. Mufasa's death left a scar on an entire generation, replayed in living rooms until the VHS wore thin. By the end of 1994, The Lion King had become a box office giant, earning over $1 billion with merchandise and home video. It wasn't just a film, it was a childhood cornerstone, a story you could believe in. And every bit of that belief was built on the idea that this was Disney's own creation, pure, untold, and original. Long before Simba took his place on Pride Rock, another prince wrestled with a kingdom stolen by blood. Shakespeare's Hamlet is the blueprint. A young heir haunted by the ghost of his murdered father, forced into exile by a treacherous uncle, then drawn home to set things right. Swap the Danish court for the savannah, and the architecture of the story stays the same. A king, Mufasa, killed by his own brother. A prince, Simba, driven out by guilt and fear, believing he is to blame. The uncle, Scar, slipping into power and twisting the land until it rots. Even the ghostly return, Mufasa's voice thundering from the clouds, just as Hamlet's father appears in the dark. Each beat falls into place. Disney's directors and writers have never hidden this link. Roger Allers and Rob Minkoff spoke openly about using Hamlet as a skeleton, a way to build something familiar out of old bones. Adaptation is part of storytelling, and there is no shame in it. The Lion King wears its Shakespearean roots on its mane, but there is a difference between honoring a classic and pretending you invented the wheel. When the lineage is clear, the borrowing feels honest. It is when the trail vanishes into silence that questions begin to grow. In 1950, a young Japanese artist named Osamu Tezuka began drawing a story about a white lion cub destined to rule the jungle. He called it Jungle Emperor, and by 1965, his creation had become Kimba the White Lion, Japan's first color-animated TV series. The show aired for 2 years, with 52 episodes broadcast across Japanese networks, and then found its way to American screens in 1966. Producer Fred Ladd brought Kimba to the United States, syndicating it to more than 100 local stations. For kids growing up in the late 1960s and 1970s, Kimba was a Saturday morning regular, right alongside American cartoons. Home video releases in the late 1980s and early 1990s kept the series alive for a new generation. Osamu Tezuka is often called the god of manga, a legend in animation circles, with Kimba as his signature work. Animation historian Jonathan Clements describes Kimba as a cultural icon, not just in Japan, but among American animators who would later shape the industry. The timeline is clear. Kimba the White Lion aired decades before Disney's Lion King entered production. By the time Disney's animators were sketching lions and savannas, Kimba's story had already traveled the world, leaving a trail that could hardly be missed by anyone working in animation. The groundwork was laid, and the echoes were waiting to be heard. A lion cub stands alone atop a jagged rock, surveying the world below. The image is burned into memory. Simba on Pride Rock. Years before Disney's animators drew that exact scene, Kimba the White Lion opened with almost the same shot. A young lion, high above the jungle, backlit by the sky. The pose matches, down to the angle of the head and the sweep of the horizon. The echoes pile up. Scar's dark mane and the gash over his left eye mirror Boo Boo, Kimba's nemesis, who stalked the jungle with the same mark. Disney's trio of cackling hyenas, Shenzi, Banzai, and Ed, move and snarl like Kimba's spotted henchmen, right down to their hunched backs and wild eyes. Even the ghostly father in the clouds, offering wisdom from another world, first appeared in Kimba as a lion's face breaking through the mist. Fans did not just notice. They documented it. In 1994, side-by-side comparisons flooded magazines and early internet forums, each frame asking the same question. How many coincidences does it take before you stop believing in chance? Tom Sito, a Disney animator, later said the team probably saw Kimba as kids, even if no one talked about it in meetings. The timeline does not lie. Kimba's images were out there, decades before Simba's story took shape. The matches are hard to brush off. The silence from Disney only made them louder. Within days of the Lion King release, questions flooded the press. Reporters asked Disney about Kimba and about the uncanny echoes between Simba's world and Tezuka's White Lion. The response was swift and absolute. In interviews across 1994 and 1995, Disney creative leads insisted they had never heard of Kimba the White Lion. Co-director Rob Minkoff told the Los Angeles Times that it was never discussed, and there was no intentional parallel that he was aware of. Nobody brought it up, nobody talked about it, nobody mentioned any similarity. Screenwriter Linda Wolverton said the same thing. Kimba was not part of the process, not in meetings, not in storyboards. Despite mounting evidence like frame-by-frame comparisons, fan outcry, and even an internal Disney memo that once called Simba Kimba, the company never budged. No apology, no acknowledgement, not even a footnote. There was no lawsuit either. Tezuka Productions weighed options and stayed silent, trapped by the tangled legal web of copyright law and by the crushing weight of Disney's power. The denials became a wall, shielding the studio from accountability, while the world moved on to the next blockbuster. The story remained unresolved, hanging in the air like a question no one wanted to answer. Disney's search for authenticity sent animators to Kenya in 1991, cameras in hand, sketchbooks ready. They watched lions in the wild, studied the colors of the savannah, and brought back thousands of photographs. Yet the film that followed filtered Africa through a lens built far from the continent. Names and songs became global catchphrases. Swahili phrases like Hakuna Matata were everywhere. But in 2003, Disney filed a trademark on those two words, locking down a common East African saying for their merchandise. The move sparked outrage across Africa, where over 80 million people speak Swahili. A petition in 2019 gathered nearly 200,000 signatures, calling the trademark an insult to a living language. Music carried its own shadow. The Lion Sleeps Tonight rings out in the jungle, but the tune began as Mbube, written by Solomon Linda in South Africa in 1939. Linda died in poverty, his family left behind, while the song earned millions for Western companies. It took decades and a Netflix documentary for his descendants to see any share of the profits. Media scholars point to a pattern. Stories, songs, and symbols get lifted, repackaged, and sold back to the world with credit and wealth flowing in only one direction. Even Rafiki, the wise mandrill, is a patchwork of African imagery, never pinned to a single culture. The hyenas have been read as outsiders, pushed to the margins without context. The Lion King's Africa is a fantasy, familiar but never quite real. Look up at Mufasa in the sky and ask yourself whose story you are really seeing. Originality still sells, but influence leaves fingerprints. As studios rewrite global stories, whose voices get erased and whose profit becomes canon, the real circle of life is this. Today's borrowed myth becomes tomorrow's official memory. Look up at Mufasa. Whose legend do you see reflected in the sky? Share your thoughts below.